For the privilege of introducing our guest speaker, Monsignor Dennis Murphy. Monsignor Murphy is a priest of the Sault Ste. Marie Diocese and a member of the Board of Governors of the University of St. Jerome's College. He was the founder and original director of ICE, the Institute for Catholic Education. Monsignor Murphy currently works with the Ontario Separate Schools Trustees Association in Toronto. He is not only respected in Catholic circles, but by the public at large, as was evidenced by his appointment to the Royal Commission on Learning. I first heard of Monsignor Murphy 12 years ago in my university days as Joni, here at St. Jerome's. My friend Barb Pace spoke often of a priest named Father Dennis Murphy, who was, and I quote, by far the coolest priest she'd ever met. It was with great love and care that Barb and her entire family spoke of their friend, Father Dennis Murphy. And one summer while in North Bay, I had the occasion to personally meet Monsignor Murphy. I quickly understood for myself why my friend Barb held him in such high esteem. His warm and approachable manner immediately endeared you to him, as I know you will discover this afternoon. And so, it is with genuine pleasure that I welcome and introduce to you Monsignor Dennis Murphy.
Thank you very much, Joni, for that very warm introduction. What we're going to do is just take a pause here while we get the technical part of this operation lined up. God, it is going to fit, isn't it? Yes. No, that's fine. That's fine. It's a pleasure to be back here at St. Jerome's College, I must say. I was noticing particularly in your introduction you had made mention of the fact that I'm a member of the Board of Governors of St. Jerome's, which is true. Probably the most recalcitrant member of all. In recent years for reasons that I think are legitimate, and so I prithee hold me excused from that particular task, which I have not fulfilled the way I would have liked to. I like to tell people whenever I have the occasion to speak what it is that I'm going to say in summary fashion, and I do this for two reasons. First of all, I like to know exactly what it is that I'm going to say myself so that I can refer back to my original directions and follow the path that I had outlined for myself. The second reason, particularly on an afternoon such as this, when you come from a full day's teaching or a full day's involvement in whatever your vocation and task in life is, and you come at the tag end of the day, I know that if you're anything like myself, there is a tendency, even a penchant, to nod off from time to time. So I like to tell people exactly where I've been so that should you lose one level of consciousness, when you return to the other level, you'll know where it is that I am. And so let me tell you very quickly in summary fashion what it is that I hope to do in my remarks this afternoon. I want to talk first of all, and what I've entitled this particular presentation is A Way into the Future for Catholic Education. And I want to do that in two parts and then just say a few words at the end about another topic that is related. I want to talk about the particular situation in which we find ourselves at the present time, and which I've defined as the making of a crisis. And I want to discuss that under 7 or 8 different topics, or headings, or elements, or dimensions, or perspectives, which I think help us to define the question of where we are. And if you, like myself, have taken at least Philosophy 101, you'll probably recall some philosophy professor saying to you that if you can define the crisis of the problem, you're well on your way to its solution. And I think that is true for the question of Catholic education at this present time. Then what I would like to do is to, in the second moment in my remarks, talk not about decisions. That was a little mistake. That should really read directions which define us. And I want to talk about some directions which I think would be helpful for us to consider as we try to work our way and wend our way into the future in determining the kind of Catholic education system which will contribute to the lives of those children whom Joan mentioned, but will also contribute to the lives of all children, not only those in Catholic schools, but all children in the province, and which will effectively contribute to public life and culture of all of us who share this society, which we call the province of Ontario and our country, Canada. And then finally, just a very few remarks on the question of the requests of other people who would like to have a school system as we do here in Ontario. So, if I can go then to the first part of my talk, it is really from these different perspectives that I want to look at the question of the making of a crisis. The way I use that particular term, by the way, is I use crisis in the more or less classical sense of that term, which means that we find ourselves in a crisis point that is a turning point, a way which is possible for us, or a way rather which is possible for us in terms of progressing in very positive fashion, or a way which could finally be quite negative and destructive of the school system as we have it. And my thesis is basically this. The thesis that I'll be expanding this afternoon in its simplest form goes something like this: that the constitutional guarantees which have helped us to understand and define what the Catholic school system are will probably not be that which will guarantee its existence on into the future, nor will it be that which help us to understand what the school system should mean. And I want rather to suggest that the guarantee and the definition of the school system on into the future must be in terms of what I mentioned a moment ago, and that is its observable contribution to public life and culture here in the province of Ontario. So as we look at this moment in which we find ourselves, I think that as recently as Monday, we have come to a realization that those constitutional guarantees on which usually we have based our right to education are open once again for discussion. There's little doubt in my mind, and I think if you talk to any constitutional lawyer, you will find a similar opinion, and they will tell you that the result of the referendum on Monday night is that once again the Constitution will open. And when the Constitution opens for discussion, then any of the elements within that Constitution become debatable once again. Every element of that Constitution is up for grabs, if you will, and that includes the constitutional guarantees which we Roman Catholics have in the province of Ontario under Section 93 of the Constitution Act of 1982. And when you look at that situation, it is reinforced by what has happened in several of the provinces in recent months. You are aware of the fact that Mr. Wells, the Premier of the province of Newfoundland, has called a referendum, which is completed, and he has received the mandate which he wanted, which is to reopen the question of the constitutional guarantees for denominational schools in the province of Newfoundland. And he will be shortly bringing before the House, if he hasn't already done so, a request that they approve his approach to the Government of Canada to change the constitutional guarantee that Newfoundlanders presently have. In the province of Alberta, if you talk to the Catholic school trustees there, they will tell you that actions that have been taken by the province of Alberta, by the government of the province of Alberta, are actions which curtail, according to their lights, the powers and rights of Catholic school trustees in terms of delimiting the frontiers or the boundaries of school districts, in terms of taxation, in terms of the amalgamation, and in some cases even the abolishment of school boards, Catholic school boards. In the province of Ontario, there is nothing immediately that this government would seem to be doing that threatens our constitutional guarantees. But if you go back one step before the Common Sense Revolution, and if you read the documents prepared by this government, which introduced the idea of the Common Sense Revolution, you will find statements there to the effect that there is nothing sacred in their minds in terms of the autonomy of school boards, that everything is open to discussion as to the possible amalgamation and confederation of boards, public, Catholic, and Francophone. And it's worthwhile to go back. So all of that to say there's great ambiguity at the present time, to put it in its mildest terms, as to the future guarantees that Catholics have to their education system in light of the Constitution of Canada. A second document that's worth looking at to understand better the moment in which we live is the Charter of Rights, which, as you know, is part of the Constitution of Canada. The Charter of Rights of the Constitution of Canada has been interpreted by the courts of this land in ways that are very much like the interpretation of individual rights as found in the United States. Many of the cases that have come before the Supreme Court of Canada that have touched upon individual rights are judged and put forward with precedents to justify the judgment, precedents which come from the Supreme Court of the United States. And if you are familiar with the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court of the United States, then you know that they come down most often in favor of individual rights. They have little concept of rights of the group and rather rule almost consistently in terms of individual rights. What that means when you take it and apply it to a Catholic school system and to the question of our way into the future is this, that some very contemporary issues which you and I discuss together begin to take on new meaning. Example one, the question of whether or not Catholic schools should have the right to preferentially hire people who espouse and practice the Catholic faith. And that is, of course, the question of Section 136. And there are many people in the province of Ontario at the present time who would say, why is it? I mean, this is part of the campaign of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, if I might mention one group. It's part of their campaign to say, why is it that one individual has a right to be hired by this particular board and another individual doesn't? And in the name of equity, of employment equity or whatever, there is a move afoot to take away the preferential hiring rights which Roman Catholics would have and which are curtailed presently by Section 136 of the Education Act. Another application of that interpretation of the Charter of Rights, which is highly individualistic, is, of course, the interpretation that rises out of people who say, my kid just lives down the street. Why shouldn't he or she go to this Catholic school? And the whole matter of open access of schools, where everybody has a right to go to whatever school he or she wishes to go to, is something that we have to wonder how it will be interpreted finally if one finds themselves in a situation where an overwhelming number of people who do not share but even are opposed to the Catholic philosophy of education find themselves sending their children to our Catholic schools. And so that is another element of the moment of crisis which we live at the present time. But by far, to my mind, the most profound element that we have to deal with at the present time is the question of secularization. You know, what is secularization? I'm sure you've heard it a million times, and it is a reality that eludes easy definition. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But secularization, whatever it means, and whether it began with the Enlightenment or wherever one historically wants to situate its origins, what it means at its basic level is a distancing of that which is religious from that which is of government, that which is of society, that which is of the sciences, that which is of education, that which is of whatever other dimensions of societal life in which we find ourselves. The sociologists use different terms to describe and define it. They talk about secularization as desacralization, taking, if you will, the sacred away from other realms or streams of human endeavor. Or they call it differentiation, to clearly define areas of social life and to define that which is religious as opposed to that which is educational, that which is scientific, that which is political, that which is economic, or whatever. But finally, secularization, as far as our interest today is concerned, secularization is a movement, a development, a way of thinking, an attitude within contemporary society that says that institutions whose mission is defined by a faith perspective must not be supported publicly by public funding. And these two are held to be inimical, and that is part of the life and part of the direction of contemporary society. What's interesting, is most of us in this room, as I look around, mine is not the only gray hair in the room I can see immediately. Some have the advantage of an enhanced color. But I think that most of us here recognize the fact that within probably 2 generations, we have moved from a Christian to a secular society. That's a profound change. And I keep saying to myself that I'm not sure whether I realize how profoundly that has affected the way that I live. And when I try to understand it, I find that I can best understand it if I transpose it 1 generation down from myself, maybe 2 generations. And I look at the young kids and I say to myself, they are young kids who have lived their whole life in a secular society, and here's the kind of thing that happens. The example that I've been giving the last few months in terms of understanding the effect and the process of secularization is this. I went to visit a school in Toronto, the north part of Toronto. It's a school of the Metropolitan Separate School Board. It's a francophone secondary school called Monsignor Chabanel Catholic Secondary School. And I went for a meeting there one day. It had nothing to do with the school, but I got there about 45 minutes early, and so, as I like to do, I wandered around the school. And I met all kinds of kids, secondary school kids doing whatever secondary school kids do, in the corridors and in the cafeteria and outside and whatever. And after I finished my meandering through the corridors of this school, I stopped and said to myself, I haven't heard a word of French in this school since I walked in the door. Not one of those kids spoke a word of French. And I walked away from that and I said, I wonder what that means. And I think this is what it means. I think if you know anything of the Francophone struggle for education in the province of Ontario, you'll know that the parents of these children struggled mightily for many years because they thought that they had a value and they had a tradition and a heritage and a culture that they could hand on to their kids, and that the tool to hand that on was the language which they cherished. And so they struggled to create their schools. And so the kids go to the schools, and I walk into the schools, and they're talking English. And I say to myself, it's not hard to understand what's happened here. Those kids in the city of Toronto spent 4 or 5 hours in the school, and the rest of their life in the teen culture within which they find themselves is an English culture. The music of much music, of the tragically hip, and even Celine Dion, when they hear her, it's in English. And their heroes are people like Matt Sundin or Shaq O'Neal. They go to the same malls and they go to the same hamburger places, whether it's McDonald's or Harvey's or whatever. They go to the same films. They have a culture and a world in which way they live, and the language of that culture is not French. And so that's the language they speak. It's English. Well, take and transpose that, if you will, into yourselves as Catholic educators, probably many of you as Catholic parents, who have decided, and your ancestors over the years have decided, that you want your children to share in what you think is a priceless gift. A gift of value, a gift of a culture and a heritage and a tradition which is Catholic and which has a language of its own, which is the language of faith. And the kids come to our schools and they come out of this same secular world. And it's the world of McDonald's, and it's the world of Shaq O'Neal and Wayne Gretzky. It's the world of much music, and it's the world of the malls, and the language of that world is not the language of faith. It's a very different language. It's a totally secular language. And so when people say to me, why aren't the kids turning out committed Roman Catholics? And I say to myself, well, let's not blame the schools for dealing with this huge social problem, if I can so describe it. Let's rather ask ourselves, how is it? And that's what I want to get into later. What is, and once again, I'm not a sociologist, but they do have something to tell us. And one of the things that they tell us in terms of passing on values, tradition, culture, and whatever is that you have to have what they call a social critical mass. And then unless you have an adequate and sufficient social critical mass with enough societal factors that impinge upon and influence the lives of the people who share that society, then whatever is of value as defined by this group begins to water down and finally to disappear. And so the question is, how do you and I together form and shape this social critical mass? And what is the root? And I want to talk about that a little bit in the second part of my remarks. Let me just move on to the question of the economic climate in which we find ourselves as another factor that impinges upon and affects this crisis, this turning point of Catholic education. Someone said to me, this may be one of those sayings that's been around for many years and that I just caught up with the other day, but I thought it was apropos, so I'll mention it. Someone said to me the other day that when you look at the economic climate of the time, that one is reminded of the African saying that when drought hits the jungle in Africa and when the water holes begin to dry up, then the animals around the water holes begin to look at each other differently. And surely what has happened in the province of Ontario, as the water hole of our economy has begun to dry up, we have elected governments that have decided that we should look at each other differently. And that's very much part of the society in which we find ourselves at the present time. And part of that change in society is not only at the level of the provincial government. If you are reading what is happening in meetings of municipal politicians these days, you will see that municipal politicians are saying, look at the amount of taxes that are collected in this community. And they realize that in many cases, close to 50% of the taxes are collected by the school boards. And so the municipal politicians are saying, how can we get our hands on that? How can we become responsible for education? And how can we have those funds at our disposal in ways that may have nothing? I don't know. I would like to think that they're thinking in altruistic fashion, but I too share with you, I'm sure, a somewhat developing suspicion of the political world. So there is this kind of problem around, and within this economic climate, I would suggest to you that only as the name of the game isn't in terms of shrinking economic resources. The name of the game is rationalization. Rationalization means that we're going to cut down the number of social institutions that we have. We're going to bring them together, or we're going to eliminate them. And those which remain in existence will remain in existence because of the fact that they're distinctive and that they are quantifiably almost distinctive, but certainly readily distinctive. And if you think that because you put the name Catholic in front of a social institution, that renders it distinctive, that's no guarantee in itself. Let me give you an example. In Toronto, about a month ago, there was a report that was prepared for the Government of Ontario, and it was a report to examine and rationalize the delivery of healthcare services in the Greater Toronto area. And when that report came forward, if you recall, they had recommendations, and the recommendations including the closing of very distinctive institutions: Women's Hospital, Doctors' Hospital, community hospitals, the orthopedic hospital. One after another, they named institutions which, by self-definition, were distinctive and made a contribution that no one else could make. But this study said, the East Toronto General can look after that, St. Mike's can look after that, the Western or Toronto General Hospital can look after that, and they subsumed these supposedly distinctive social institutions, in this case healthcare institutions. They suggested that they be subsumed under existing general healthcare facilities. So what does distinctive mean? And I want to get to that too. I think that one of the other things that's worth mentioning is the fact that in the society in which we live, only those social institutions will continue to exist where there is agreement among the people who run these institutions or who are partners in these institutions only if they have a shared sense of the objectives and the goals and the meaning and the purpose of the institution. And again, that's from the social scientists, who tell us that in the kind of rapidly changing social world in which we find ourselves, unless there is agreement among those people who run the institutions as to what the institution is about, then it won't continue to exist. Now, I mention that because of the fact that you may or may not remember that a number of years ago at the Institute for Catholic Education there was a study done that was called the Blishen Report. And the Blishen Report asked a number of questions of various partners, if you will, in the Catholic educational enterprise, a number of questions as to what the goals and objectives of Catholic schools were. The partners that were asked this question were the teachers, the trustees, the clergy, and the parents. And if you look in that 1988 study, you will find a significant divergence among the partners as to what Catholic schools were all about. And I would suggest to you that if we ever repeated that study in 1995, some 7 years later, that we'd find even a greater divergence. That says to us that we've got a question to answer. And the question, of course, is, can we as a social institution in a rapidly changing society with very divergent goals expect that we are going to be an exception to the social rule of the continuity of institutions, simply, again, because we put the word Catholic in front of our school system? There is as well a big question as to whether or not the Catholic community cares and how profound that caring is to maintain the school system. And I don't think we have data on that right now. As a matter of fact, I think that's a task which we should put to ourselves, to get data on what is the level of commitment of the Catholic community at large and various segments of that Catholic community to our education system. And finally, I would mention as well as that, I might add that as well as the indifference within the Catholic community, there's positive opposition, aggressive opposition on the parts of other people who would like to subsume the Catholic school system and their organizations. I mean, there are teacher organizations that would like to subsume OECTA. There are trustee organizations in the public school system that would like to subsume OSSTA, and so forth and so on. And so I think that as well as the indifference within the Catholic community, there is a clearly defined and very articulate, aggressive opposition that has been developing to the Catholic school system. Finally, the lack of distinctiveness, if I can get back to that question of distinctiveness. When I worked on the Royal Commission on Learning, one of the things that I found out very quickly as we went around the province and heard from the various partners in Catholic education, we heard from trustee groups, and we heard from teacher groups, we heard from parents, and we heard from kids and whatever, that my colleagues on the commission weren't overly impressed by what they were impressed by the Catholic school system. I must say that any time we were in a Catholic school, it was always very welcoming, but they weren't impressed by its distinctiveness. They weren't sure that it was as distinctive as it said it was. And even in some of the areas where one can recognize a level of distinctiveness, and I think particularly here of the area of social justice, when questions were put to student groups, for example, they were rather inarticulate and seemed to share the secrecy of what the social justice teaching of the Catholic Church is. And so my colleagues didn't see much distinctiveness. The public often sees little distinctiveness. And the media, I think we live in a media that's presently pummeling and pillaring us, quite frankly. And they don't see much distinctiveness. Now, that leads me then to say, if there is no distinctiveness, how do I get to my someplace here? There's another one. How do I get to the directions which I think have to define us and to clarify the way into the future, which is ours? And I want to go right back to distinctiveness, and I want to talk about the contribution to public life and culture, which I think can be ours in terms of distinctiveness. I realize that this is a very difficult task that we have set for ourselves, and I'm not the only one. This is not new language to all of you. It's a task that I think all of us almost, again, what would the philosopher say, co-naturally? Is that, got the right word, Jerry? Not bad for many years away from that world. That the philosophers would say that we know in some way there is a contribution which is ours. But what I want to suggest to you is that at this stage in the game it's mainly anecdotal. All of us have met people and heard the stories about the bus drivers or the healthcare professionals who come into our schools, or people from the Ministry of Education, and they report back to somebody someplace and say, I always know there's some difference in the Catholic school system. As I say, that anecdotal evidence, I think, is something that all of us have heard, but I would suggest to you that we have a task that calls us to articulate in much more precise fashion what it is that we see as a distinctive contribution to public life and culture in the province. And I know it's a difficult task. How do you quantify, and that's what people want, how do you quantify that contribution? It's sort of like, I like to tell people that it's like if you're in business and industry and you have a research and development branch in your firm, the moment that there is economic downturn, the first branch that's cut in its funding is the R&D, the research and development. And usually this is done because you can't quantify the contribution that R&D makes to the company. And yet most people will tell you that successful business operations are those that have a good research and development branch. But it's very difficult to quantify it. Or to put it in other terms, if you look at the Royal Ontario Museum, or you look at the Ontario College of Art, and somebody says to you, do they make a public or a contribution to public life and culture? And people say yes, and you say, what is it? How do you quantify it? Very difficult. And I think in similar fashion, the task of articulating the contribution that Catholic education and Catholic schools makes to public life is a difficult task, because in our quantifiable society, this is not something that is readily and easily quantifiable. Nonetheless, I think it is part of our task, and we have to set our sights on this. You've probably seen already some of the documentation that has come out of the Institute for Catholic Education, where they have attempted in general terms to create a broad framework for the development definition of outcomes for Catholic schools. And I think that is a worthwhile piece of work. What I would suggest, however, is at the present moment we have a task to make that much more specific. And I think we have to look at outcomes in terms of students, in terms of outcomes. Let me just I'll use the word once in a while, but it'll only be a slip of the tongue, because I'd rather talk about expectations. What are the expectations that you and I share, or what are the expectations that the Catholic community in general should share, and what are the expectations that society at large has a right to have in terms of Catholic schools? And what are the expectations that they should have in terms of the students who graduate from those schools, and what are the expectations that they have a right to have in terms of the school systems themselves? And so if I might take each of those three areas and speak about it for a moment. As far as the students are concerned, it seems to me that we have every right to expect that students who graduate from our schools will be students who understand not the theological depth of a systematic theologian in terms of what our faith is about, but they should know what the kerygma is. They have to know basically and be able to articulate what it is that is self-defining about Roman Catholic faith. And I think that sometimes we make that much too esoteric. I think in some ways I would like to be able to ask the student who graduates from a Catholic school and receive an answer that would be something like this. That a student would say that at the center of the Catholic faith is a fundamental belief, in the goodness of humanity as being called into existence by a God who calls us on a path of life towards Him, despite the frailty of the human condition. and that within that frailty of the human condition, the same God has introduced into our existence His Son as an expression of His care and solicitude, a Jesus who comes to heal what we cannot heal ourselves and mend the brokenness in human life that we cannot heal ourselves. And I think that I would expect that student to be able to say that as a result of that self-understanding, there are attitudes to life and its meaning and ways of acting which follow as night follows day from that charisma, if you will, of Christian self-understanding. I would expect those same students not to have as a great secret, but to know quite clearly, again in somewhat summary fashion, what the social teaching of the church is. And I would expect them to know how it should, not how they apply it, how it should apply to the social situations of the day. I would expect them in some way or other to know, for example, that there are questions within Catholic social teaching that apply very precisely to many of the directions in which our society is going today. I wouldn't expect them to have the same answer that I would come up with, but I would expect them to recognize that there are questions and that these questions, flow directly from the social teaching of the church. I would expect those students as well to some way or other know what the meaning of celebration is. I would expect them to know that there is a celebratory dimension to Catholic existence, a dimension which in some way or other is the public way in which believing people come together to express the concerns of life which touch them most profoundly. I don't know whether you heard this morning, there was an interesting thing on the Peter Zowski show when I was driving down to a meeting, and it was Andy Barry in Toronto, and he was talking about ululating, and they brought on a social anthropologist from York University, I think, who described what ululating is. It's that do we have any social anthropologists here? But it's that cry of native peoples in Africa particularly and in various parts. And they use that particular common way of making a sound, which is not a sound of a language, but it's a sound that they make together both to mourn and to celebrate, to call to battle, to all kinds of things. What it is, it's a common sound in which peoples involve themselves in to express a social concern that touches them collectively in profound fashion. In some way or other, I want our kids to know that's what liturgy is as well. And I think they have to have a sense of that, even if they say no. I think I want our kids as well. I like to say, for example, that one of the things that I personally believe is profoundly important in an age where we know how far away we are from, how far away our society is from the ideals that are defined as Christian ideals. I want those kids to know that there's nothing new about failing to achieve those ideals. And if they know anything about our history, they will know that our history is a history of people who have not been AA or AAA players, but we've been major league pros as far as sinfulness is concerned. And because of that, we have a sense of forgiveness and reconciliation as part of our culture. I don't know whether you share this with me, but I find I was in a meeting as recently as yesterday when some young woman said things in a really contentious voice about the institutional church, things that I happen to agree with. They were criticisms. And I agreed with the criticism, but I didn't agree with the contentious way in which she said them. Our tradition, and I would like the kids to know, our tradition is a tradition of people who have sat with their asses against the backs of seats in churches behind pillars for years and years. And we have accepted those people as part of our community. And we have accepted all of that imperfection in different ways as very much as part of our life. And I would like the kids, and I would expect them to graduate from our schools with that kind of understanding. And I would expect kids to graduate, therefore, with the moral and intellectual development which go together. I don't think it's part of our Catholic tradition that there is such a thing as the sort of ideas of Socrates that you can celebrate, you can nicely distinguish between knowledge and virtue. I don't think that's part of our tradition. I think that in some way or other, the way in which we understand promotes and undergirds and gives direction to what there is of virtue within our lives. As well as students, though, I look to systems, school systems. You say, what does it mean, a school system that has expectations? Well, the kind of expectations that I would look for in a Catholic school system, I would have an expectation that their policies would reflect a commitment to marginalized groups within society. I had occasion the other day to talk to a number of people in Hamilton, and I don't know what inspired that policy of integrating disadvantaged or handicapped or challenged kids, whatever the politically correct term is these days. I don't know what the reasons were that inspired them to make that policy as part of their school system years before anybody else seriously thought of it. But I do know that that policy, whether it was inspired by their Christian convictions, certainly reflects Christian conviction. And that it's a school system that, at least in its policy, is distinctive. Let me get a couple other examples. I was in my old alma mater this past summer, and I had a little office there for a while at Schollard Hall in North Bay. And one of the consultants came along one day and said, "Come on downstairs. There's something there that I think you'd like to see." And I went downstairs, and downstairs I found a daycare center. And I walked in the daycare center, and it really was very well furnished, with all kinds of toys and plastic slides and things for kids. And the kids were there from this size to this size. And there were a bunch of women, many of whom I knew, but they weren't all Roman Catholics, who were looking after these kids as volunteers. And I thought, isn't that nice? I wonder what this is about. And then I went down the corridor further, and here was a class. And in this class, there were about 15 young women. And the consultant said they are taking a course in life skills that is offered by the school board under the credit in secondary school, which is, and I can't remember the credit exactly. And so these young women, who, of course, were the mothers of these kids who didn't have basic life skills. I used to think all my life that everybody was born with life skills. I thought everybody knew how to budget, and everybody knew how to shop, and everybody knew how to prepare a menu and all those sort of things. That was another area in which I was wrong in life. And so I saw all of this thing offered by the board, and I thought the most interesting comment in the whole thing was this. The young woman who was the consultant said to me when we were going out, she said it almost in embarrassed or abashed fashion, she said, actually, most of those young women there are not Roman Catholics. And I said to myself, that's the kind of program, don't be embarrassed or abashed by it, the Catholic school board should offer to the community. And I'll tell you, one thing that I was really proud of is at the end of the summer, the board had a meeting, and they looked at areas in which they had to cut. And they took this program and put it over there and said, we won't cut that. And the board also, I lost my train of thought, but they made that kind of a commitment as being a program towards which a Catholic school board should allocate its resources, both human and financial. I can give you other examples of that kind of thing. The Metropolitan Separate School Board in Toronto offers a program to immigrant people. And I said to them, I went and talked to the teachers in the MSSB who deliver that program, and I said to them in the course of our discussion, I said, there are lots of people that offer programs to kids. Why? Or to adults who are immigrants. This is just another program, isn't it? And they said, well, not quite, because we think that as well as the language program that we offer, we think that we have a responsibility to fill in the gaps in their lives. And so we try to tell them what the culture means in all kinds of different ways. We try to tell them how they get around town. We try to tell them how to shop. We try to tell them where their churches are. We try to tell them about healthcare agencies. We try to create a fabric of life that has meaning within a Catholic and caring context for them through which they enter into society. And I said, yeah, that is different. And I want to say once again, my understanding is the Metropolitan Separate School Board has a profound commitment to that particular program, and they have no intention of cutting it. And so who cares if we cut the motor mechanics program or the woodworking or whatever? I think there are distinctive programs that systems can offer. And I can go on with examples like that. And so I think it's fair to say that we look for we have expectations of systems that are different. The last area is, to my mind, the most important one, and that is in the area of schools themselves and whether or not we can have expectations of schools that are not only distinctive, but which in some way or other constitute a contribution not only to Catholic life, but to the life of the total community. And I would suggest that if you look in the report of the Royal Commission on Learning, which I'm sure all of you have read every page of all those many volumes, but if you look in Chapter 13, which is on community education, you'll find that community education is put forward as one of the 4 engines or levers upon which the whole report is founded. If you've looked at the report, you will remember that there is information technology, teacher professionalism, early childhood education, and community education are the 4 pillars or engines which we, as the authors of that report, felt were necessary to introduce significant and coordinated and integrated educational reform in the province. But if you read Chapter 13 on community education, you'll find that that's probably the only place where the report says that educational reform won't be affected unless community education is introduced. And I think that not only myself, but I think the other people on that commission recognized that community education is probably the most difficult of those levers or engines of educational reform, the most difficult to introduce or to effect, but also the most necessary. It's a hard task. It's a hard fight to do that. But why did we think this was true? Because it's through community education, if I can go way back to what I said earlier, it's through community education that one can create the social critical mass that can overcome that intrusive secular influence that kids have to. Means that what you do effectively is you seek to create a whole web of alliances between a broad variety of social groups with their social influence. You try to bring them together so that there is an integrated approach made to the nourishment, the development, and the education of kids. It means effectively that what you do, and let me just stay in the Catholic community for a moment, what you do, and I had a great example of it. I was in Thunder Bay the day before yesterday. No, what's today? I'm losing track. I was in Thunder Bay on Monday, and the director of the Catholic board there told me about the alliances that they're establishing with Catholic family services, with the Catholic healthcare system, and the business community. And they are starting to move out to try to create a whole web of alliances, which will effectively mean that education in that board will be delivered not simply through a school board, but through this web of alliances. And the meeting that I was at, where the director told me this, was a meeting where all the directors of education came together within the diocese to talk with the bishop of the diocese and with some other people as to how those web of alliances should include as a major partner the parishes and the diocese itself. If that can happen, and that's the thrust of that particular recommendation in the Commission report, if that can happen, then there's some possibility that there is a social critical mass that is as powerful as the intrusive secular culture that surrounds and overtakes us at almost every step. And so that is the meaning and the thrust of community education. How does it happen? Well, it happens... do we have any principals here today? Because I always... yes, we do. Well, one of the interesting things, and I'm surprised, and that's enough, as long as I tell the rest of the principal. One of the things that in that report that is of great interest is that there's only one job description that changes radically. And that job description is the job description of the principal. And it's not even explicitly said in the report. But community education rises or falls on how the principal understands his or her job and the job description. Because those
community alliances have to be established at the level of the system, as I mentioned a moment ago, in terms of directors of education, also at the level of the government, so that there's some kind of ministerial intercooperation at that level, but none of it will work unless it happens at the level of the school. That's really where it will happen. That's really where effectively there will be some kind of agreement, some kind of common cause that is joined by people who say, yeah, we got these kids and we love them, and we also have a great gift that we want them to participate and share in. Not an easy task. But, you know, the kind of things I like to tell principals when they get nervous, and I've had occasion to talk to principals, and they do get nervous when you say, none of us like to change our job description. Most of us like life on cruise control. And to change that is a difficult sort of task. I mean, I think we all understand that. And the example that I use, and I have someone to even in this very room who will back me up on this contention. When I was a parish priest, I used to hate parish visitation. I found it the most difficult task you can imagine. I mean, it meant shoe leather. It meant every night, month after month, you were out knocking on doors. Some people didn't want to see. I mean, they were going out, and even if they weren't going out, they didn't want you to come in. But after all was said and done, I knew then and I knew now that it was the most effective and most important pastoral activity in which I ever involved myself. And the reason is this, that you finally came to know sort of what was hurting and what was helpful, what was being celebrated and what was being avoided in the lives of all kinds of people. And even more importantly than that, you recognized a kind of resource within the community. Now, you know, in retrospect, I wish I had utilized the resource. I think to some extent we did. But it's extremely important, and my suggestion is that's the role of the principal now. The principal has to use shoe leather within the community to find out who's there, to find out what the resources are to help in the task, and to start to establish the alliances that can respond. Different in different school systems. In a secondary school, it's a very different reality than in elementary school. Nonetheless, to my mind at least, it's crucial. And it's crucial not only for those very pragmatic reasons I think that I've tried to underline. It's crucial because of the fact that you and I finally believe that it's in that broad community that the Spirit works. And it's in that broad community that the word of the Spirit is to be discerned. And the task of the community is in some way or other to gather, and to hear the Word of God in terms of how we care for our children. We've taught, that's part of our tradition. That's what parish and school and parish and family are supposed to mean. That's the familiar triad that we have used to describe education. Now I think we talk about community education, and I think it's fundamental to what we're about. Just a final word on community education, how important that it is. The bishops of Ontario, in that moment of promise pastoral letter, which they put out a number of years, they said it, but I could see that when they said it in that document, they didn't want to say it too profoundly. I know that they would say it today, 6 years later, without hesitation. The place where most Catholics touch the institutional life of the church is at the level of school. And that is a new social reality of our time. And for us to understand where it is not only that the school is going, but to where the Catholic community is going, for us to understand is to take into account that role of the school, which I don't think we've defined in those terms, but I think that we're in the process of defining. And that kind of expectation of the school, that is a big-time expectation of the school. Donald Pasterski, everybody knows Donald Pasterski, the man who wrote those books on kids, and you know, with what's his name, Bibby, Reginald Bibby. He said one time in talking to a group of Catholic supervisory officers when I was there, he said one time, he said, you know, when I look at the Catholic school system and its history in the province of Ontario, he said, I can see different moments where different of the partners were involved in various ways. And he said, I can see moments when the parental community took over and led the charge in terms of creating schools and school boards and things of that nature. And he said, I can see moments when the clergy, when the parish and diocese played a leadership role and animated the community in terms of what its goals should be and how it should set about achieving those goals. Pastursky said, who isn't a Roman Catholic, by the way, I think he's a Baptist minister, as a matter of fact. Pastursky said, as I read the Times, the ball is in the court of the Catholic school community. And he said the ball is in the court of the Catholic school community because within the broad Catholic community, it's the school community that has the human and financial resources today. And much, to a much greater extent than does either the parental, the family, or the parish or diocese community. So all of that by way of the expectations of schools which are Catholic. I'll just say a very quick word on curriculum at this time. We have to expect that our curriculum has within it an integration that flows from initial development rather than from simply a situation where we take common curriculum from government or from the Ministry of Education or from elsewhere and baptize it with the understanding that in so doing it becomes Catholic. What I mean by that is that the moment that we're living, we have a number of Catholic curriculum cooperatives in the province. I don't know how aware you are of those. And they are working at this time, but we're very much in a stage of transition from taking documents from the Ministry of Education, which if you read them in their initial form, you could read them without even knowing that a Catholic school system existed in the province. And we're moving, I think, towards a moment when we are going to create a curriculum that is inclusive of the understanding of faith which is ours, inclusive of the fact that we are a people who speak of virtue rather than value, an important point that we could spend some time on. Value is so individualistic. It's so relative. Virtue comes out of our tradition. It's prescribed an habitual way of acting in terms of attitudes towards life which are profoundly important to our Catholic tradition and a Christian tradition. Justice and caring and charity and love and compassion and whatever. And they flow out of a community understanding of something. In any event, I think we have to look for that curriculum which is inclusive. And I like to tell people when I talk about that we have a big lesson to learn from the women's movement in terms of inclusive curriculum. And what I mean by that is the women's movement recognized early on in the game. Right from the beginning, the women's movement recognized that to be excluded, to use exclusive language, is to render unimportant, to trivialize, and finally to make invisible a group of people. And I would suggest to you that when you look at curriculum in the same way, that to think that one can pick up curriculum that is secularly developed and that it does not have an effect is to accept a curriculum that effectively makes unimportant and trivializes and ultimately renders invisible Christian understanding of life. So I think that's very important and a big-time expectation that we must have of the development of curriculum. And finally, in my last remark, which I'll do very quickly, this is real water. Even it may be better, who knows? That is to say, and if again I can just refer you to the pastoral letter of the Ontario bishops in 1989, this moment of promise. In the concluding part of that letter, I'm going to say more than they said. I think I don't exaggerate to say they would say more today than they said then. But what they effectively point out in that pastoral letter is that those of us who have a Catholic school system by constitutional right have a privilege. But that there is also a natural right for any group of believing people. And that natural right, if you look in the documents of the UN on education, you'll see that they attribute a natural right to parents to educate their kids in academic gatherings where their faith convictions are supported. And if you look in the teaching of our church on education, you'll see that once again we say there's a natural right for any group of parents who wish to educate their children within the context of faith to have their own educational institutions. I think in any way, if we are to be just and if we are to be logical to our own convictions, then part of our task in society at this time is to stand with our brothers and sisters in other faith communities. And I don't care whether those faith communities are Jewish or whether they are or Hindu communities or whatever they are, then I think we must support them in their request, because although they don't have a constitutional right, they have a natural right to those schools, and we must support them in their endeavor. So that's all I'm going to say for now. John told me that I should leave you with some questions as well. There's one, as you can see from my remarks, there's one area that interests me particularly. It's the area of community education, because I think that it is effectively the only way that we'll create that social critical mass that will be the environment and the culture within which there will be communicated to our kids what it is that we think is of value in life. And so my hope would be that you might discuss this kind of question, that if that is a vision that you share, if you share that vision, I would like for you to discuss in whatever groups you break into, if that is a shared vision, what is the reality that exists now in your life, in your experience, in your school, within your board, and what are the obstacles that are involved in getting from the reality in which you find yourself, what are the obstacles and the barriers in getting from the reality in which you find yourself to the vision of community education, which is a Catholic vision? Is that a fair enough question? Is it a clear enough question? Is it clear enough? Well, it's really two questions. And the first question is, if that's the vision, what's the reality in which you find yourself? And if that's the vision, what are the obstacles or barriers in getting from A to B? Fine.
One of the things I would suggest, John, if it's all right with you and with the rest of the gathering here, is that we do set a time. And I only say that because things that die with a whimper rather than a bang are always rather distressing. So
why don't we make the upper limit 7:15, and if you finish before that, so be it. But we won't stay past that.
Great. Okay. Okay, but we may have a show and tell in terms of why we want to get home for various reasons. So I think, as I understand, we've come back together, and rather than discuss in groups and see if we can come up with some questions, there may be questions or comments that arise out of what we've been discussing together, or in anything else as well that is in some way even obliquely related to the topic at hand. And Kathy, we'll start with you.
I wonder, could you kind of expand on that notion of the role of the principal and the view of
The question is, I have to repeat the question because they're taping and they miss the question otherwise. And so Kathy's question is, can we discuss further the matter of the new role of principal, which I suggested very quickly was implicit in the recommendations of the Royal Commission report that touch community education, and I would add to that touch school councils as well. Kathy, I think, and as I say, I believe that that new role of the principal is implicit rather than explicit in the chapter on community education. And from my remarks, you can gather that I'm suggesting that the role of the principal should be redefined in terms of his or her responsibilities to effectively create that web of alliances, which is the social structure of community education. To me, that means that the principal has to be out in the community, trying to recognize the resources that are within the community and trying to define and recognize the needs that the community's children bring to the school each day. In the course of the hearings of the Royal Commission, I made it a point to ask as many principals and other informed people as I could. I said to them, you know, the literature keeps saying that the primary role of a principal in the school is as curriculum leader and secondly as resource manager within the school. And I said, how many of you think that principals theoretically are and practically are curriculum leaders? The answers that I got, and I have to say that this was not a scientific survey, but it was a question that fascinated me and has fascinated me for a lot of years, and I had a forum in which to ask the question. And the answers that I got indicated that although a lot of people would theoretically say that, no, a lot of people knew that the theory was that the role of principal was curriculum leader, they didn't believe it and they didn't practice it. And I would go further and say that I think that the role of principal as curriculum leader is in a very general way, and that their more important role is as one who brings together these partners within the community. And the one who, if I can even expand further on that, school councils are going to live or die in terms of the involvement of the principal. And if I can refer you back to the recommendations again of the Commission in relation to principals, the suggestion in the Commission report is that principals should take on an expanded role within the educational community. They should be given greater autonomy and greater financial resources to exercise that autonomy in terms of site-based management or whatever one wants to call it. But the report of the Commission went on to say that principals should be given that responsibility only if they have defined and submit to the board a strategic plan, and a plan which outlines, first of all, how they involve the staff in collegial decision-making in determining the life and programs and directions of the school, and secondly, how they set about involving the broad community within the school, and that means, of course, in the establishment of the school council as a primary tool or instrument of community involvement. So that is, so just last comment on that. School councils. School councils have been defined by, I find it absolutely fascinating in the conversations that I've had with people in the last 6 months to hear the way in which they talk about school councils. People who don't want school councils, and almost to a person, it's absolutely fascinating to see the Freudian slip that comes in here. People who don't want school councils inevitably call them parent councils. And it indicates to me that they have real fear of parents. And I'm not talking just about teachers or principals, I'm talking about trustees as well. I sat on a panel with a public school trustee whose name I won't mention, but well known in the province, and she kept saying parent councils. And I finally picked it up and I said just what I've said to you. People who are opposed to them inevitably call them parent councils. And it's for a lot of reasons. It's because of the Parent Advisory Council and what they ask. Nonetheless, there is a certain trepidation among educators in terms of these parent councils. And I understand that. And there is the possibility, and this usually is the big fear that surfaces both at board level and at staff level, and that is, you hear it all the time, we will have special interest groups which will take over the school council. And my response to that is that's very possible. And you will have special interest groups that will take over school boards, and you will have special interest groups that take over municipal councils and even provincial governments. I can remember when we argued this out at the level of the commission one day, I said to Jerry Kaplan, who was opposing it, I said, what are you talking about? I said, a special interest group just 2 years ago took over the direction of this province. It's called the NDP party. And so that argument doesn't bear much analysis, I would suggest. And so the fear, although it has some justification, I don't think it's something that should concern us. And I would even say further to that if I were a principal in this day and age, I would be out of the blocks so fast in terms of establishing parent council, you'd see nothing but dust. Because it's going to be those who move to determine the shape and form and effectiveness and role of parish councils as principals who will determine whether or not they effectively assist as a partner in education or whether they become sort of an anomalous appendage that threatens and perhaps goes back to the hot dog and cocoa roll. Hot chocolate. Doug?
Take that and apply that to the new role of unity leader, and recognize that we're going to require a different skill set. It's also going to be a top 25% of what is kind of going on today. We have raised the question of it's pretty clear if you're thinking of a business curriculum here, what that means. We've lived that for years. But if the principal is a community leader, what is it that he or she is supposed to be doing? He's doing that extremely well. I don't know. I don't know if we have an answer to that. Does it mean the person that's probably the first Ireland type? I don't know. But certainly it takes away from the part of the kind of scared in. I'm not scared of the council because that doesn't mean everything else is good. There is a dark side of the problem. But if what is it that the principal is going to do with the school council that will make that extremely good of integrity and objectivity? That's what I think.
I can't give you an exact blueprint, and I can't give you the job description of the principal as a community leader and animator as I see it. Let me start from the extreme end of the understandings that are around the question of community education. In case any of you weren't following Doug's question real closely, I mean, he's really questioning, and I think quite legitimately, my definition of the role of the principal. And I realize that is debatable, what I've said, and I think you are, in any event, if I understand you correctly. So let me make my argument for what I've said. There are many levels of understanding of what is called community education, and if you look at the literature, you'll find that at the bottom end of the spectrum of understandings around this phenomenon that's called community education, the bottom end, it means nothing more or less than the sharing of school facilities by a lot of different groups in the community. And so when the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides and the Catholic Women's League want to meet, then you put the school facilities at their disposal. That's the bottom end. The top end of understanding, I think, in terms of what community education means, would really define the school as holding the responsibility for bringing together various elements within the community so they themselves can define their social agenda. That they can say, these, in this community, here is the social agenda. And therefore, as community, we have health needs, we have counseling needs, we have nutrition needs, we have immigration needs, we have, and on and on and on. And having defined that, then that group says, we have these resources within the community to respond to those wide variety of needs, or we lack some of those resources, and therefore we have to go beyond at least our geographic community to other communities to see if we can respond. So at the top end of the spectrum, and it's really in that sense, I must confess, that I understand community education in its best sense. And I see the school council then as that particular vehicle through which, see, the principle, according to the definition of school councils that is in Policy Program Memorandum 122, is that there will be a majority of parents, the chair will be a parent, and then it goes on in vague language to say there will be other people, and that you can go out and get these other people. Within the Roman Catholic community, one thing is quite clear, that those other people involve some participation from other significant ecclesial expressions of church, or institutional expressions of church, rather. And that means, at the first level, it means what's the relationship to the parish or parishes that relate to, that are contiguous with, that from whose particular parish boundaries the kids in the school come, from the catchment area. And so that is a level of relationship, but it's also a level of relationship with the healthcare community. Better yet, if it's a Catholic healthcare facility, with social welfare, Catholic Children's Aid, if such a thing exists. And so the role of the principal, as I envisage it, and of course business and industry, social service agencies, the Rotary, the Knights of Pythias, and whatever, all of those in some way or other, can have a contribution, to make, and can help in responding to the need for an integrated approach to the multiplicity of needs that surround and define the nourishment, education, and development of kids. Big task. I know it's a big task, and principals aren't prepared for it now. Part of that, therefore, and to deal with that, therefore, would be to look at the newly established College of Teachers, which takes responsibility for the professional development of teachers, and say to them, you've got to change the courses. Got to change the courses radically. And because of the fact that there is an understanding within the Catholic school community as to what community is, and because of the fact that other ecclesial institutions are seen as part of that community, then there's big time difference between what you do in the preparation of principals for Catholic schools and principals in the public school system. And so you deal with it on that level. But I think that that in many ways, so that's one level, Doug, if I can answer in terms of the job description of what it is I see the principal doing. But I wasn't kidding when I said that I thought that part of the principal's responsibility was a shoe leather responsibility, to be out in the community and in some way or other to be known in the neighborhoods that make up that community, to be seen, to be visibly present. That's not new language, as you know. I mean, that's the language that they use in terms of community policing, the language in terms of delivering health care within a community. The visibility factor is very important so that there is an identification of people within neighborhoods with that person who, according to my description anyway, is bringing the community together to define its social agenda. And so it means shoe leather, and it means being out there in that sense as well. And I don't want to move away from the role of the principal as curriculum developer. But I would define that aspect of the principal's role in terms of what is the total environment that we are trying to create in this school through the integration of many services, an environment that we think is finally the learning environment for that kid. So I think you take curriculum, and you take curriculum one step past the Hall Dennis definition of curriculum, which you may or may not recall, which was a definition of curriculum that embodied all of the experiences the child had within the school. I'm not remembering exactly, but that, and I would say that this definition of curriculum that I'm suggesting for the principal transcends that in the sense that it goes beyond the walls of the school and begins to build up a learning environment that is out in the community as well, and try to affect, I was going to use the word control, rather mobilize that community in ways that it consciously is aware of its responsibilities in the education and development of kids. But that's just where I am in my thinking on that question right now. I think it's a question that requires all kinds of rethinking. I'm sure that you could shoot holes. You people could shoot holes and say, you see what's going to happen here if you do that, and see what's going to happen here if you do that, and you're forgetting this and you're forgetting that. I'm quite sure that all of you can think of things like that. But that's an ideal, at least that I have. I think it's workable, and I think it's what the Commission is about. I'll tell you, we argued on this particular. I mentioned earlier that this is the only one of the four engines that we say is absolutely necessary, and we quote Thomas Sergiovanni right at the beginning of that chapter on community education to that effect, that any effective school reform in this day and age must be built on community education. And and we argued long into the night on that sort of thing. We finally convinced one another that was true, but we realized the very difficult task. But most important, and as I said earlier, more important for a Catholic community. If I just before I can just make one more comment on that. See, I think that we have to institutionalize the arrangements between the Catholic institutions. Institutionalize the arrangements between Catholic. Well, aside from the redundancy, what I mean by that is that let me give you an example. One of the things that we have great problems with throughout the province, maybe you don't have the problem here, but lots of places in the province have problems with the question of delivering pastoral and chaplaincy service to Catholic secondary schools and even to elementary schools. We haven't defined exactly what that role is. There are a group of people who are working on a definition of that right now provincially, and other boards have worked on it locally. But there are still lots of questions. One of the things in times of economic constraint, and I say to myself, the people who finally have responsibility for pastoral care and animation and chaplaincy services within the Catholic community are people who come out of the basic pastoral institution, which is parish. And why don't we look there for this resource? I'm sure if some of my classmates were here, they'd be building a scaffold for me right now. But it seems to me that that's where we look for the pastoral resource. I mean, that's where the resource in terms of spiritual direction, in terms of celebration, and you can say, well, geez, in my parish it's pretty. Maybe it is, but that still is within the broad Catholic community. That's where the resource is, and I think we have to look there and say, doesn't that part of the Catholic community, which we call parish and diocese, have a responsibility? And shouldn't we structure that into how we do education? And then if you take it in another way, the resource within the Catholic community as far as educating people is within the school system. And we have all kinds of adult education programs within parishes and healthcare institutions. I sit on the board, or did sit on the board of the Catholic Children's Aid Society in Toronto. They have all kinds of adult education programs. And so they put them in and they struggle with them. The big resource is within the Catholic school community. And we really don't turn to one another, and we don't establish structured relationships for the development of and delivery of these various services. If we did that, I'll tell you, we would have a distinctive looking school system. It would look very different from the public school system. I'm not quite sure how I got off on that. It's getting late in the day. Please. I don't know. You tell me. That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. Probably, my guess would be that a lot of different models would be out there if you did that. I mean, I'm quite sure to start with, you'd have some virtual schools. Yeah. I mean, that'd be a real great question just to spend all kinds of time on and say, what would this look like? My feeling is that one thing it would surely look like is something that's different from the public school system. And I think that's important because then you are able to do that very difficult quantifying task that I was talking about earlier. I think you're able to define more exactly the sort of expectations and outcomes that you have, and in some way or other, even though it's difficult, you're able to apply a quantifiable analysis to them. Bob?
As you talk this kind of socialization, share, there's also a lot of conversation around education in terms of entrepreneurship. You live a monopoly over it. They really are open. But what I'm wondering
The Commission certainly looked at that, Bob, in terms of, first of all, charter schools and then some of the other manifestations of it, even in terms of the kind of initiatives that the learning, what do they call it, the learning partnership has taken on that seems to be running into trouble with the OSSTF unit in Toronto. And all I can tell you is that having looked at it, we rejected it. And I think we rejected it because we felt that finally, just like healthcare systems which seek to set up too many private facilities, you quickly run into two levels of the delivery of healthcare, and so you would run into the problem of the delivery of two different levels of education. And that was on the basis that we rejected. That was the basis on which we rejected it.
I was really surprised this summer at how many friends I talked to in different places, for one reason or another, wanted to see the traditional school system, wanted to do the college system, wanted to enter for profit market, themselves, whatever it is. It's a surprising theme that I heard in a number of different places. Many thought we had to do with technology too far out, especially if we don't create
I think you're right in the sense that a lot of people are talking about it. But I'll tell you, to a person, the Commission rejected it. Yes.
secular activities
Recruit them for the school council, you mean? I think that's true. I don't think I said right from the outset that this was the generic task of implementing community education is difficult, and to try to involve a lot of people at the level of a school council is difficult. But for every bad experience with a parish council, if I can go back to your example, I know some very good examples of people who have had successful parish councils with the membership involved. And I think in some cases it's been very threatening to the parish priest, as it can be to the school principal. But because that's a difficult, I agree with your concern. Your concern is part of the non-involvement of people in social life. That's part of it. That's right. That's part of our society, and we're not simply, because of the fact that we espouse community education, going to overcome that social inertia that is part of our society. Social inertia in terms of involvement. But because that is, one of the debilitating factors, what I've been describing is obviously the ideal. And I realize perfectly well that the reality is here someplace. But I just describe all of my life in those terms. And so I'm not particularly chagrined by the fact that this is going to be uphill and rocky. See, I think that what we have to do, if I can just take and transfer that example into a broader picture, I think what we have to do within our school system in terms of defining the expectations that we have in this regard, but in all other kinds of regard, expectations of students, schools, systems, structural relationships, whatever, I think we have to define what it is that we want to achieve. And I think we have to define our efforts of achieving it, and I think we have to evaluate to what extent we achieve what we're about. And in that whole process, then we define ourselves differently. And in that whole process, I think not only do we define ourselves differently, but I think we make a contribution to, and if I can get back to where I started almost today, we make a contribution to public life. Because our vision is going to be different, and I think the way in which we seek to realize it is going to be different as well. And I think that we have the possibility in the definition of our vision and in the definition of the steps that we take to have a coherence and to have a consistency which flows out of a common faith commitment that we share. I'm not sure whether people realize how important that is and what kind of a contribution that makes to a society which doesn't have any sense of common value. And it really doesn't. And I would say if you want to see the lack of common value, then read the report for the love of learning, the report of the Royal Commission on Learning, and you'll find in there little sense of common societal value. The Commission couldn't come to that kind of a vision because there were too many disparate voices speaking to it. You'll see great consistency in the chapters and the parts that touch upon the Catholic education system, because all of the Catholic partners, I must say that despite the divisions we have among us, when they came to present to the Commission, whether they were the teachers or the trustees or the kids or the parents or whatever, they kept saying the same things. Maybe the language was somewhat different, but it was very clear, and I mean, this was not my conclusion, it was the conclusion of the other people on the Commission, said, geez, your people, they keep saying the same thing. They want the same sort of thing. That in itself is a profound contribution that we can make to our society as far as I'm concerned. I mean, and to the kids within it. I mean, the kids today, as you know, in that society, that secularized society that I was trying to describe earlier, I mean, they really sort of ricochet from pillar to post in a conflicting world of values. And we will help them immensely if the total community consistently and coherently says what it is about, recognizes why it is not getting to what it is about, and takes another step. That's there's no utopia in my vision. I think I'm just as hard-headed a realist and as pragmatic and practical as anyone. I think I am. John?
I wanted to just pick up on secularization.
I really like the example that you gave of the school, where French was the language used, but where the kids didn't speak French. And the reasons for that would all make sense. An interesting question for me would be if we track the teachers in that system, see if they would speak French. I would have a guess about that. Because I would imagine that the Anglicization that's present in the culture that gets people to speak mainstream English would be there for teachers as well as for the students. So then my question, coming out of Huangli, is about secularization. And what happens to teachers who live in a socio-cultural milieu which is secularized, and what do we have to say to them to kind of rally them? Given the fact, especially that teaching has become, developed a metaphor a few years back, there's the old Dr. Seuss's thousand hats of all of the covenants, and we talked about teachers having to wear 1,000 hats. It's a complicated business these days. So I wonder if there are some words you could say about how we help teachers to be able to respond to the challenges we secularize as well.
Maybe I can go back to the Francophone community and use it again as the example. It's really in many ways over a number of years I've used the Francophone community as the example because it's always helped me in understanding what it is that we're about and what their struggles are. You can also use the Native community, by the way, in very interesting ways. But what the Francophone community has set out deliberately to do long before I or a lot of other people ever started thinking about community education, they set out to bring together their varied social institutions. And so in communities, it's not, and like those kids in Toronto, I don't know, if things continue in Toronto the way they are, I mean, I think the Francophone community will disappear. I really do. There's not enough social support for it, by the way. But not in places like Ottawa, certainly, and not in North Bay, probably, and not in Timmins, and not in Sudbury. So without going into the... And the reason is, I think, John, is because people in places like North Bay and Sudbury, if I can use them as two examples, they consciously set out to create culture and recreational social institutions for the world of Francophonie. And they had... they got involved in the university community. There may be problems in the university community in Sudbury at the present time, but nonetheless, they set out very consciously and deliberately and to create that broad internet of social connections, or social institutions were connected with one another, and the teachers were right part and parcel of that. They were significant players in the formation and the running of that. And in some way, I would apply that to Catholic schools. I mean, I hear lots of people, we've got lots of problems with the institutional church. What's new about that? I mean, I don't have a huge problem with that. I've got lots of problems with the institutional church. I mean, the institution always is slow catching up with social change. I mean, social institutions by their nature have a pathology, and the pathology, you know, is one of you know, sort of the ecclesiastical version of arterial sclerosis, and there is that kind of natural hardening of the arteries and a sense of self-preservation. But that's natural and human in institutions. But I think where institutions change, strangely enough, people who read history tell me that every significant revolution doesn't come from the poor and oppressed. It comes from middle-class people like us together here who finally say, no, this is not working, and we push hard. And I think that that's true within the so-called institutional church, whether that institutional church is in terms of the institution of parish and diocese or the institution of a school system or a healthcare system or whatever. And so I think that teachers can play a very significant role in touching not only the institutional life of their school, but they can push parish and diocese to get into relation and push healthcare institutions and whatever. I go back to what Pastursky said before that I mentioned. I really believed Pastursky, and I was very much impressed when he said This is where the resource of the Catholic community is in this historical moment. It's in your school system. That's from a Baptist minister. And I think he's right. And so I really look to the educating community, the Catholic educating community, to bring about the establishment of those relationships that will assure their survival and the necessary support of teachers, but also a lot of other people. But there are, just one other comment on this. I'll give you one last example on what I mean by this, the necessity of building this social critical mass. I went one night to visit a group of parents of Native kids in Toronto. And the Toronto Board of Education has a school in downtown Toronto, an old school. Actually, it's one top story of a school for Native kids. And they try in that school to teach the customs and the values and whatever. So the kids will have some sense of their tradition and culture and heritage and all of that kind of thing. And they try to teach the kids in Cree as well, in as much as they can. I think it's Cree. It may be OG Cree, but I think it's Cree. And so I met with these parents, and we were talking and blah, blah, blah. And they wanted more of this and whatever. And I said to them with a little, I must say I was a little fearful when I said, don't you realize that what you're doing here is impossible? There's not enough social support for these kids in what they're doing. The community is too small. It doesn't have, you can't possibly create the critical mass here in this community to achieve the goals that you've established for yourself. And there was this was interesting to me because one of the mothers who was there, as it turned out, was a doctoral student in sociology. And she argued with me for a long time, but finally she said, I know you're right, but we've got to do this. So that's just another example to what it is, I guess, that finally I'm about and what it is that I'm suggesting. We can still do it. We still have the critical mass if we pull things together. Please. I'm glad you gave me my answer before I had to do it myself. There isn't a black and white answer to the question, but I suspect that no matter where Section 136 goes, no matter how that, I'm quite sure that if that question came before, you know what I'm talking about, Section 136, which is, everybody knows that, okay. I suspect that if that came before the Supreme Court of Canada tomorrow, they'd say it's non-constitutional and away we'd go. But I also feel that if we were to move in the kind of directions that we've been discussing tonight, that even if the Supreme Court of Canada said something else, we wouldn't have a problem. Because effectively what we would be doing is creating an educational milieu. And in that educational milieu, the only people who were not Catholics who would still have interest would be people that would serve the same ends that we have. And we wouldn't have tons of them, but we would have people like, I rather suspect that kind of community that I'm talking about, that only people who were very much akin to and aligned with our understanding of the human enterprise, only those people would feel in any way comfortable within it. And I think that if in our schools we had a curriculum that was infused throughout, no matter what the discipline was, no matter what the time of the year was, no matter what classroom you were in, if it was suffused with the vision of faith, which is ours, I would suggest to you that we wouldn't have to worry about too many parents who would be sending their kids into our classes. So even if we didn't have Section 136. So it's a question of creating not a climate in which other people are uncomfortable, but creating a climate which they feel they can't conscientiously contribute to. And Section 136 says that if they can't consciously contribute to and espouse, then we have preferential hiring rights to say no. That's Section 36 as it now exists. Doug? I mean, there's once again, unless we in some way or other, unless you have some secret of expunging the proclivities of sin from us all, I don't think it will ever happen. But the kind of thing that I've mentioned a couple of times tonight as a process in looking at things, I really think is the way that is helpful, and that is that if you have a vision or a mission statement or a series of expectations or outcomes or goals or whatever, I think that is a step, but you have to really clearly define and let the people who are in the process define where are we in relationship to that. And then I think you have to let the people also say, what are the barriers that prevent us from getting here to here? Some of the barriers are very personal. They are, I don't agree with the teaching of the church on this or that, and this, to my mind, personally, is a barrier. That's why I can't get from here to here. Some of the barriers are systemic. They have to do, I don't like the way this system is organized. And people will say there is effectively no collegial decision-making in my school, and I don't think there's any in the system. Or they'll say those, so you get personal reasons that are barriers and you'll get systemic reasons that are barriers. But I think the exercise itself, I mean, that's not original with me. You've seen that process before. But it's a process that I believe in very much. Because I don't know what your experience is here, but I've talked to a lot of people, and they say, God, here we go into the mission again. Or here we go in the mission statement. We're building a mission again. unless they know this kind of process is going to take that I've discussed, and unless they know that building a mission is an ongoing process that goes year after year after year after year, I mean, I think if people are challenged to say, well, you know, here we did arrive at this mission either collectively or maybe it was imposed from on high, I don't know, whatever way, unless people can say that's there and we're here and this is what's in between us, then I think that we spin our wheels. I don't know whether that... Bill? Yes, and I'm quite sure that can happen. I can think of other... I don't know about the board here, so I won't... so I won't comment on it, but I do know of other boards with similar kind of situations, and in some way or other, at a certain level, the kind of process that I'm sure all of you would like to have take place is going to be slowed down and it's going to be vitiated by the lack of discussion up here. I'm not sure. Do you think it has to be totally vitiated? Do you think the kind of discussion between vision and mission and goals and objectives and reality and the barriers, do you think that's totally impeded because of the fact that you have a board here that you're really going to have to push hard to get into that process themselves? Can you still do it down here? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there are lots of things over which a board has no control, and I'm sure there are lots of things over which an individual school has no control. But there are lots of things that people can do that don't require money. One of them is community education. There's not a lot of money, as I look at it, that's required to move in that direction. There's not a lot of money that is required to take large secondary schools and make schools within schools. There are, I think, a number of recommendations that, those are two that just come to mind, but a number of recommendations that help achieve this vision of community education that don't cost anything. And they don't cost anything in terms of dollars and cents, and they're doable even if you have a relatively inept level above, whether that's the board or the ministry. So I would say, I mean, I agree with some of the difficulties that are around, particularly in this time of financial constraint, but I think, Bill, there are still things that are doable. And I suppose at this time I would say let's do what's doable, and particularly let's do what's doable in terms of those things that define us distinctively. Kathy?
Two simple questions. Let me address the first of your questions. You know, like Ed Asner, I mean, I didn't like nostalgia when it was new, so I don't think that I don't think that I'm working from a position of nostalgia. I know what you're talking about. I mean, I've commented to people in Toronto that it's incredible. When I was a student at the University of Toronto, I can remember meeting classmates, and you'd say, "Where are you from?" They'd say, "I'm from St. John's Parish. I'm from Blessed Sacrament." And that's how people identified themselves in those days. That is no longer possible. That is not where we are, and I'm not suggesting that we go back to that. But you can hear, Kathy, from what I've been talking about today, I am really influenced by what the sociologists tell us about the possibility of community as the place where values and faith and belief and attitude is preserved and developed and handed on. And so I'm saying, yes, create community. And you're saying you're afraid that it's going to be a ghetto. I'll use the sociologist language and say, no, I'm talking about a cognitive minority. And they say that that's the only area in which that you can develop and transmit values. That in our highly individualistic society, unless people can come together in mutually supportive networks or alliances, then it's impossible to end up with anything but a totally relativized value system. And that's why I mentioned earlier the word value itself bespeaks that individualism and relativism. And so what we need are these cognitive minorities. Those cognitive minorities are not ghettos. The genie is out of the bottle. The Catholic community will never go back into being a ghetto. That happened about 1983, I think, or 84. It's interesting. People define that ghetto mentality, which was part of Catholic life in the past and which was a necessary strategy or tactic of survival, I might add, for people who felt besieged and undereducated and all those various things. But social scientists whom I have heard say that around, interestingly enough, about the time of the papal visit, there was a new self-understanding within the Catholic community. It no longer defined itself in ghetto terms, but rather in terms of what it had to live and to offer public life. And so I think that genie is out of the bottle. I don't think we can ever go back into a community. I think when we, into a ghetto rather, I think that when we try to say, how do we define the community, I think that they're going to be extremely varied. I don't think that community education in School A is going to be the same as in School B. I don't think even the makeup of the school council is going to be the same. I think in the city of Toronto, there is going to be in a downtown school like St. Paul's, which is down at Queen and Sackville or whatever, in that area, I don't think you'll have the same kind of community and community education that you will have in Whitfield outside of, at some so that's a nice little part of North Bay for the uninitiated. But I do think that you can form this web of alliances, and I would say that when you get into the area of secondary schools, where geographically it's impossible to have, because of the size of the catchment area, to have what is defined as a geographical community, then you will have, and I used the word earlier, you may have some virtual community, a community that exists only in terms of a common interest shared by people who communicate to each other, I don't know, by distance education, by internet, by whatever. But there has to be the coming together. There has to be the web of relationships. There has to be mutually supportive alliances that integrate the way in which we care for our kids, and that overflows in the way in which we care for each other. And I don't see that as returning to a ghetto. I think it's recognizing the way in which a faith community has to exist in contemporary society. Your second question I didn't understand. No, this is true. Well, yeah, that's a huge question, and I agree with you. One of the. Let me give you an example of something that I think is very interesting, that is related to what you say. One of these days, we're going to get provincial pooling in the province of Ontario. I think that's probably true. Which will mean that there will be more dollars for the kids in our school system. Some people are in favor of regional pooling. And what that means is that Board A, which is public and which has the same jurisdictional area as Board B, which is Catholic, they pool all the resources and they share them on that basis. Now that means, of course, that a board in Toronto or a board in Ottawa, the Catholic board, if it shares with the public board of either Ottawa or Toronto, is going to be really rich because this is big-time assessment. One of the things I've always admired is the Metropolitan Separate School Board has said publicly, we are in favor of provincial pooling. Provincial pooling means in the long haul they'll get less money per student. And that kind of commitment, I think, is really important. I think it's in the direction that you're talking about, is how we apply our own social justice principles to what it is that we're about, and how we distribute the educational dollar, and whether or not we say some of those programs that we were talking about earlier, such as care for the marginalized, whether they be single parents, whether they be immigrants, whether they be whatever, people that are disadvantaged and hurting, whether or not we give priority to that in our spending estimates. I think people are thinking in those terms, and of course one of the huge areas is how it is that we relate to one another in the area of collective negotiations. That's a huge area. And what's interesting, for the first time I think I can say that I've been around the educational world for a good number of years now, first time I think I can hear both the trustee organization and the teachers organization saying, geez, maybe we do have to change that model. I mean, look where it's taken us in terms of the social contract. Look where it's taken us, that model. It's taken us to, bad seeds. So I have some hope there that something would happen. And I'll tell you, if we could ever do a leap there, we would be distinctive as an educational system. We would be very distinctive.